So, I found myself starting a new series. And I'm calling it the Musings series because the first one was Musings on deterrence, and it was just a little flick through some of the ideas of deterrence and how you do that. And well, that led to more questions. And I thought what I'd do is I'd do a little bit of a series. Or an ongoing series. Whereby if people put forward questions and comment, there's lots of questions around a certain area, I'll give you some musings, some thoughts and ideas of how you approach it and how I approach it. Because I found myself in a lot of these discussions over the years. Especially when it comes to procurement. And the thing I find always the most annoying is the standard option when someone when they announce more money for defense in any country is not what existing programs do we have that we need to reinforce, backfill, what capabilities have we cut to the bone. It's what new toys can we get? And I'm going to use a toy expression, despite the fact I hate it when it's used in defense. I hate it because it infantilizes defense. And I can see why people chuck it away and go, oh yeah, these are just toys, and they're not. Here's the thing. If you're talking about a tank, which if it gets destroyed, could potentially lead to the deaths of the 4 people inside it who are crewing it, perhaps don't call it a toy. Or a warship, which could have a crew of 200 plus if they're a standard escort. Again, get sunk, those people are quite probably dead. If it happens fast enough. They're not toys. It sounds so cool to sort of throw away at the line. It just doesn't work that way. But I still use that despite feeling that very strongly, when it comes to that scenario, I do use that phrase. Because the desire is always, hang on, we think we have to fill this role, this mission, these people doing it, this equipment is really good. If we get that, that's going to add this capability, that capability, that. The real question is, what's the problem behind you? Before you add new capabilities, fix the ones you already have. That's what you first have to do. And again, when you get into this, the amount of times when you start talking about it, people go, well, what you need is you want another aircraft type to complement the existing aircraft type. Or would it be cheaper, overall, in the force structure, to get more of the existing aircraft type? Because then you don't have to set up another logistics line, you don't have to set up another training line, you don't have to set up another basing command structure, you don't have to recertify everything, you don't have to go through all the safety and procurement message, and you don't have to go through all the business case and all the other issues and all the other massive consultations that will eat into the cost. You just buy more of what you're already doing, which have already got all these things in place. Because usually you get that argument, people go, well, if we buy this other aircraft's unit price is cheaper than this aircraft. Oh, good. How many do you want to buy? Oh, let's match buy. Okay, so now you have not just that unit, because you're already buying the first unit, you're not going to reduce your buy of them. You now have to set up all the same systems to support that. And they might individually be cheaper, but eventually, once you add it on, it would have probably been cheaper to buy an equivalent number of aircraft of the first system. Because then you're just expanding existing things you already have, rather than trying to build new ones, and not having to go through all the process of development and proving it. You also have other issues in procurement. You have governments. The classic example I use is BAE, when they were British Aerospace Engineering, for those who don't know, when there was a period where the British Ministry of Defence were anything but BAE, and we won't procure anything through BAE. And that guided decisions like the Ajax program, and love the General Dynamics option or hate the General Dynamics option. The fact that the CV90 wasn't considered properly as part of that program because it was part of the BAE family worries me. Yes, the CV90 is not perfect. But to not even have it at the table as part of consideration, one of the most common and capable and most used by many of our allies' systems, seems strange. It seems short-sighted, and we can talk about it with the French as well. The classic example is the Charles de Gaulle. The fact that the French government were basically not in agreement with their largest yard, and so they didn't build the best version of that carrier they could because they went to use a different yard for political reasons. And yes, you can say politics is always part of procurement, but you're talking about the nation's capital ship for the next 30, 40 years. Surely something like that should trump politics. Base personal politics. And we can go beyond that. We can look at some of the American procurement decisions. We can look at some of the American issues. You know, the short-sighted views of cancelling the Zumwalts. People go, oh, well, they're not needed, or the railgun didn't work. Yes, they had become a Christmas tree project. Yes, they'd added a lot of other stuff on them. But the fact is, that was your newest, best architecture for engineering, for power supply, and if you kept on building a few of them, that production line could have covered you until you had a proper replacement for the Arleigh Burkes worked out. Instead of trying to make the Arleigh Burke architecture fit the new systems you want to put into it, and keep the Arleigh Burke trugging along. The Arleigh Burke is a lovely ship. It truly is. It's world-beating. I will not disagree with that. I will also point out it is the flower of 1970s thinking. And whilst a lot of work has been done to improve them, and there are a lot of cool systems, and all the crew of them, they will always be proud of their ships. I'm saying that the US Navy should be being served by something so much better. But they kept the LCS program chugging along. They took ages to shut that down. That really was a problem. The Zumwalt, well, the issues with that were that the railgun, which was supposed to be developed for it, didn't work as planned. So you cut the whole ship. You can put other weapons in the place of the railgun. Everything else is working. It's a decent design. And you need something which is going to be a presence capability maximizer, especially as your TCOs are going, and your Burkes look tired and old at the moment, because you're running them ragged. Something like the Zumwalts turning up, they look striking and scary. And I can get into Russian and Chinese and other nations' procurement. But the thing is, I don't really feel like having this video turn into a pile-on by all their bots turning up going, no, 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 we never make any mistakes. You're a country which involves humans. The base point is you're going to make mistakes. I'm sorry. I don't know what it is about certain nations which think that because of their unique political situation or unique culture, they will never make mistakes. They are suddenly no longer human. You're human. Ergo, to err is to live. You therefore will make mistakes. And petty things like politics will get involved. And sometimes things like, we want something which looks like what they have, because we know what they have is good. Well, we can make something better. No, no, we want what they have. That will turn up. So this video is musings on procurement. And, well, I'm going to have a shameless book plug. Of course I am, because I always have a shameless book plug. So please, if you'd like the videos, please do consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, because this channel is basically about naval history, but my PhD is war studies. It was war studies from King's College London, hence I'm wearing my King's shirt today. I was doing stuff in the garden, hence the hat and the shirt. It's always easier to clean black clothes. And, well, the PhD I did there was on the development of naval aviation in the 1920s and 30s, and when I came out, I had this idea for a book. And that book's Tribals, Battles and Darings, which is the shameless book I'm plugging, well, a book I'm shamelessly plugging at this precise time. Why am I plugging it? Well, it's on its second edition. I rather like it. I'd like it to get to a third edition, because then I get to add in extra chapters. But more importantly, the more of them I sell, the better in a position I'm in to get a teaching post or something at a university. And I quite like the idea of that pension scheme. I really do, while it still exists. Believe it or not, YouTube videos do not produce a pension scheme, which is rather sad. Not that I'd ever really stop doing them. I have a feeling I'll be keeping on doing this as long as YouTube allows me. I'll keep on doing videos. But I'd like the pension scheme as well, so I don't have to, I can be even more, how do I put this, me. And not worried that the logarithm might hate me or all sorts of things. To be fair, I don't worry about it that much anyway, but we'll leave that to one side, or I wouldn't be doing videos like this. So, first thing for procurement, know thyself. What are you? What is your country? Are you a superpower? Are you a minor power? Are you massively exposed to global trade, or are you mainly trading with a couple of local neighbours? Does your trade go by sea? Does your trade go by rail? Does it flow by air? What are you? There is no point in designing or procuring systems which do not suit you as a nation. Are you a populous nation with a large and growing younger generations? Or are you an aging population which has reducing numbers of younger people, so therefore needs to consider systems in that sense? Do you have a thriving economy which is providing lots of gainful employment that your armed forces are going to have to compete with to hire people? Or are you a fundamentally poor country where, frankly, your armed forces are probably going to offer the stability and long-term employment that quite a lot of people are going to be hunting for, so therefore you're quite an attractive offer? Know yourself. Procurement is always taught about dealing with external threats. No, you first have to start off with you. Do you have a large industrial manufacturing base? Do you want to build the things yourselves? Or do you not mind importing them? Do you want to import components and finish them off in your country? Do you want it entirely to be R&D, research and development, in your own country? What is necessary for not just yourself, but your own political scenario? For example, Britain, a few years ago, had a major issue because they ordered their tankers, and the tankers were built for the Navy, were built in Korea. They were finished off in the UK, but they were built in Korea. The hulls, etc. That was, building for warships abroad. No warships. And at the time, the British yards were overrun dealing with the legacy of the Type 45 program, preparing for the Type 26 program, building the Queen Elizabeths. And all the mucking around and politics involved in that. But it still caused issues. And you could argue that argument, that debate, and the issues it caused for the government, which was a noticeable impact for a government which in the UK, which prided itself on, well, defence doesn't really affect the national popularity of the government, doesn't affect it, suddenly actually shifted opinions in the opinion polls. Not by a lot, but by enough to cause them to worry, which is one of the reasons why now there's been money found to keep Appledore going, perhaps, and for Harland and Wolff to move from just supplying the offshore energy market to back to building ships, and all sorts of systems and things being encouraged. Now, some of those companies that are doing that, those yards are British yards, but they're no longer British companies. Rather an interesting scenario. The British body politic cares more about the physical location of where something's built than the company that's doing the building. Now, in some countries, like France, they care about the combined thing. It has to be built in France, it has to be by a French company. That is their primary desire. And that is a primary thing for their political purpose and their political, their political situation. In America, they're closer to Britain. Because whilst most of their companies are American, some are Canadian, and the largest non-American defense supplier is BAE, British Aerospace Engineering, who own a lot of factories and a lot of companies in America. There's also an Australian firm as well, which was involved in the LCS project. So, okay, America and Britain have a slightly more similar style. America prefers it to be American by American companies, but they will accept others, as long as it's done in America. Britain, well, especially thanks to the period of anyone but BAE, which the Ministry of Defence went through, because they decided they didn't like them, because they'd had bad experience with them, but they basically created a single source supplier. So for a few years, Britain had, it's going to be built in the UK, and it's going to be built by BAE, because they're the only options. And then they decided anyone but BAE, because they didn't like them anymore. And now they've got some competition going on, but it's very limited competition in Britain. Because Britain likes to build it, it all has to be built in the UK, which means those facilities pretty much become monopolistic on that area of production. For example, Type 31 small frigates are going to be built in the exact same yard the whole way through. People will talk about Type 32 is going to be open to tender. It won't be. We know that. Because there's a yard. So, pretty much, knowing thyself in terms of procurement for countries can be including of, well, what do we see procurement as? Do we see it as primarily employment of in Britain's case, of British people, and French of French people? Do we see it primarily through the market of employment, or do we see it through the market of security? What are we looking at it through? Knowing thyself makes a difference to then the procurement further up the chain, because second, know your threats. You see, here's the interesting thing. If your threats are organisations like the Barbary Pirates, then the heavy frigates of the US Navy in the early 19th century make a lot of sense. But if your threats are bigger organisations like the Royal Navy of the early 19th century, then you need some ships of the line as well, because these are going to rule the waves right up until the larger ships of the Royal Navy arrive. They're going to dominate the British frigates, because the British don't have need for that many of these ships, or anything really equivalent to the ship. They do have rosés, because the British have the full fleet. But the US Congress was being the typical US Congress of the period, and they allocated said they allocated the funds, they'd ordered the ships, and then they just not built them. And so those ships of the line were not there when they needed them. Which is why the War of 1812 goes like it does. The Americans are rollicking around doing great guns of basically almost a privateering, raiding war, economic warfare on, some fairly good moral victories, we'll say, because they didn't go for the gold ships, the ship, the gold ship, it's the silver ships coming from South America. They didn't go for the various ships which were really vital to British global trade. Those silver ships from South America were the key thing with the Eastern trade with China, which was key for some of the stuff done in India, which was basically the whole economic hub that was keeping the British economy going in the Napoleonic Wars. And they don't at any point go for those silver ships. And the reason they don't go for those silver ships, by the way, is because the Royal Navy, from the moment the war begins, guess where there's a place which is the first place that gets some third rates, i.e. ships of the line, showing up? You're right, it's the South America station area. I can't think why. It was considered more important to reinforce there than it was to reinforce the America station. Knowing your threats. Know yourself, your own procurement tendencies, but also know your threats. What are you threatening? What are you going to be fighting? Are you going to be fighting a huge land war? Do you have land borders? Do you need to defend that? If you do, your army probably is going to take a chunk of your money away from the other services. Because when you have a large land border and you need to defend that area, well, land borders soak up funds and personnel like a sponge soaks up water. They just do. They can just seem to never-endingly absorb even more and more. Are you a nation which is, let's say, surrounded by mountains? It's entirely mountain-locked with very limited access points. In which case, your major threats are things coming over the mountains, i.e. by air, and things coming through those limited mountain passes. That can again structure it. You probably don't need to worry much about a navy at that point. But you probably need to have a fairly decent air force, and you probably need to have a well-trained army that can reinforce those choke points and turn them into areas that can protect you. But you also have to remember that means you can be laid siege, so you also need to stockpile resources, because you're basically the equivalent of a natural fortress. Whoa, hey, that's wonderful. Safety in natural fortress. But, as has happened a few times in history, if your enemy has got a wonderful fortress which is very secure and easy to defend, leave them there. Let them sit in there. Let them starve. Take the rest of the country. So you need to think that through. Are you a maritime nation? Are you an island nation? Do you depend on global trade? Do you have a load of alliances you need to honour, so which are key to your security, which means you need an expeditionary capability, maybe of varying levels? Is your primary territorial threat to your home base going to be airborne? Because if it turns into maritime, if it turns into seaborne, then you've got a problem. Because that means a lot of allies are gone, and your own seaborne deterrence has failed. And then if it turns into land, you've got a massive problem. And that scenario, you have to start thinking in terms of, how do I keep the opponent as far away from me as possible? Because that's the best defense. The best defense is fighting the enemy as far away from your home as possible. And that's defense of your home, by the way. And that's the thing that governments have to care about. Defense of the home. What happens if you're a massive continental power like America is? From sea to shining sea. Glorious. But there's also an issue. You're a massive continental power. Your main defensive depth is the sea, and is keeping those conflicts probably the other side of the ocean, those oceans. But you have to then keep making that case to your public. And those threats can seem an awful long way away when you're looking at an ocean. When you're looking at the vastness of an expanse of the Atlantic and Pacific, you can go, well, they're the other side of that. They're no problem to us. You can point to global trade. You can point to global communications. But again, if you're large enough, it's a problem. Because people will point out, well, you could get all that here if you look in the right places. And you probably can. But you also probably can't. The thing is, countries which are so resource rich, so secure, are usually also some of the more developed countries, which means they have a very developed political system. And that political system will have checks and balances in it, which might well protect things like the natural environment, because they want to preserve and conserve the natural environment, their heritage, their flora and fauna heritage for future generations. That could have an impact on things. Now, you also have to remember, when you have a mature political system, has weaknesses just like an immature political system. An immature political system usually has threats of dictatorship. A mature political system can have threats of destabilization, because usually mature systems get into a rut. And people believe things will always be done the way they have been done by convention, because they've always been done that way. The thing is, others can manipulate that, and that can become a threat to you. You almost need to constantly be refreshing and recommunicating your culture, your political methodologies, the reasons and for things, the whys behind conventions. Constantly. Not just with each new generation, but with the whole wider public. You need to always be explaining yourself why you do things a certain way, and you need everyone to buy into that, not to just use it when it suits them. And that's difficult, because it's oh so attractive, and always has been, to go for the headlines. People talk about Twitter and social media, where it's these short, snappy phrases, as if that's something new. Headlines, the title parts of gossip, have been going around as part of human nature and human politics for as long as there have been humans. I mean, I'm fairly sure if you look at some of the cave drawings, there are probably somewhere in there, vote for Alid as chief. He has a big sausage. I'm sure there are all sorts of other ones, but, you know, that's the sort of thing that's been around for as long as humans have been human. To pretend otherwise. It's also like pretending that other nations have never got involved in politics before, have never tried to support other powers, other potential sources of influence, have never tried to influence political campaigns before. They have. One of the most silly things Kaiser Wilhelm used to do was talk quite loudly about who he preferred for which posts in the British government. And it'd be repeated by the gossip rags. And so then the Prime Minister would be in a very big problem, because if he wanted to put that person in that post anyway, He could get accused of listening to the foreign, the Kaiser. And if he decided he didn't want to put him in, he could be accused of just doing that because of insulting the Kaiser, or just doing that because he didn't want to agree with the Kaiser. It's a great way of interfering with things. It's also done by silly people. Because you only make enemies that way. You don't make friends. And that's really the problem. Because in the first thing of threats usually we consider are external, but sometimes they're internal. Sometimes they're state actors, sometimes they're non-state actors. Which is a great piece of modern history. The idea that we call things state actors or non-state actors, because all the world is a stage. Kind of like toys for pieces of equipment for defense. The whole world is stage, it's all acting. You're not lying, you're acting out your part on the stage of the world. It's, again, been a turn of phrase I have to use because it's the accepted nomenclature of my field. It is. But it's not a good phraseology when you start looking into it. People often point out, well, no, it's describing the people who act on events. These days, almost influencers would seem more appropriate than actors. But that's the problem. There is perhaps no good phrase to describe it, other than maybe states, nation states, rather than state actors, and non-state organizations. And that's before, of course, we get into NGOs, non-government organizations, and Quangos, quasi-autonomous non-government organizations. Oh, the world is fun. And the thing is, sometimes you can look at those organizations within another country, and you could be seeing a range of scenarios. Parts of that country could be friendly towards you, part of the country could be antagonistic. And why can that become a threat? Well, it depends. Are the parts that are antagonistic the Foreign Office and the Defence and the Ministry of Defence? Because if they are, then you have problems. If the Treasury is antagonistic, then get ready for war. But you need to know your threats. You need to know what you are as a country before you can make a proper assessment of what your threats are. And you need to think through where it's best to manage your threats, because procurement is at its best about not just warfighting capabilities, but conflict management, i.e. deterrence, minimization, and potentially, but we always prefer, pacification. Conflict management basically breaks up into deterrence, trying to deter a conflict. This can be by overt force or by diplomatic signaling. Minimization, that often comes from making friends in an area around an enemy to to isolate them also, but stop them being able to call in allies to widen the conflict. And pacification is, of course, stopping the conflict. Ideally, if you are a nation which knows yourself and knows your threats, you should be able to use deterrence and minimization to de-risk a lot of conflict. But that doesn't mean necessarily you can always get by with having the smallest and least amount of equipment. Because sometimes the way you minimize conflict and you deter conflict is you turn up with overwhelming force. So you have to always imagine what is that overwhelming force that I can best deploy. And different countries can employ different sorts of overwhelming force. For some nations, a carrier battle group might be appropriate. For others, it might be a strike bomber force. For still others, it might be an armoured division. Some might want to turn up with all three, but, you know, there is always someone in a room who's special. So this is the point, working out your requirements per the above. If equipment doesn't fit into protecting what you need to protect, or affecting what you need to affect to protect what you need to protect, do you need it? Now, I think the F-35 is a great aircraft, so please don't take this as me attacking the F-35. I did a video the other day and people going, oh, you're attacking the Queen Elizabeth class. I wasn't. I like the Queen Elizabeth class. I think we've managed to fudge up the whole... the UK has managed to fudge up the whole procurement strategy behind the Queen Elizabeth class because they've now gone on for the MSS and all sorts of things instead of going the route which would have made most sense with some LHDs replacing Ocean, Albion and Bulwark, and probably the LSLs as well, let's be honest, and having 5 flight decks. And so being 5 large flight decks, 3 large docks, and 3 amphibious-orientated flight decks, and 2 strike-orientated flight decks. And before someone says, well, you know, what about the American class? The America class, America's LHDs, etc., are very much amphibious-orientated. But the whole ship internally is. If you were building this for the British scenario, you basically, like with the aircraft carriers, they have... Whilst they are strike-orientated, they have some amphibious tinges in them to support them assisting in that role. And you have to work that in at design level, in the construction level, in the way you plan and shape the internal arrangements, the internal organisation. Britain hasn't gone through that. But there again, Britain also didn't get enough Type 45s. And didn't buy them with the Mark 41 VLS cells installed from the beginning, so they couldn't have SM3 and Tomahawk from the beginning, and all sorts of things which would have been useful. But them's the breaks, because if you go into procurement, if you go into these things without having first properly assessed yourself, and then properly assessed your threats, you are going to not be able to do this. You're not going to be able to work out your requirements. One of the most blindingly obvious problems in procurement for most nations since 1991 has been the assistance in that peer conflicts were not going to happen, or were so remotely unlikely that, frankly, you didn't need to worry about it. And 2, that not everyone accepted it, but a large body seemed to accept the idea of wars of choice, especially in the political classes. They accept the ideas of wars of choice, i.e. that the major powers that remained after the end of the Cold War were so powerful that wars would only happen if they chose for them to happen to them. Otherwise, no one would dare take them on. The thing I find really annoying is that there were also governments at that time around that time and not too far later, who claimed they'd solved the fundamentals of the world economy, and it would be never-ending boom from then on. There would be no more bust. There would never be any cycle in economic terms. It would be a constant, steady progression to glory, and constantly better and better finances, which the governments could bank on and bet on and borrow money based on the idea of. They had solved that problem. So they'd solved all the world's economic ills, and they'd solved all the world's security ills because there wasn't going to be wars unless they chose to have them. The fact that that sort of thinking survived for roughly 25 years as a predominant thinking, and you can argue even longer actually in a way, for the best part of 25 years, despite 9/11, despite all the issues in Kosovo, in Yugoslavia, despite all the Gulf War issues, despite all the litter of minor conflicts and deterred conflicts and all the other issues, is really quite amazing. It's a shining example of how willfully stubborn people can be. To be fair, the idea about the economy did survive until about 2010. So that did almost the best part of 20 years. And the economy is something which fundamentally likes to attack when it has the opportunity. The economy is kind of like the sea. It will be calm and placid, and it will work with you even when it's not, as long as you respect it. But never for one moment believe you can control it or command it. The moment you do is the moment you've created your worst enemy. Human nature is like that as well. We spent a lot of years believing we had a control on the world, we had a handle on the world, and we didn't. When it comes to requirements and working out what your procurement is, you have to work out your capabilities, broadly speaking, in 3 categories. Essentials, necessaries, and would like to haves. Essentials are things you cannot do without. And by the way, usually, some people put logistics capabilities underneath all those 3 and say that feeds in and decides your logistics. I always say the logistics facilities sit in the essentials. Logistics and infrastructure in the essentials, right there. And it doesn't matter. The fact that they expand, depending on how much of the other stuff you have, doesn't matter. They are essential. If you do not have the logistics and infrastructure, you don't have the rest, so don't even bother. So I would say they're on the straight in the essential. They're not their own category, they're essential. And essentials can be what you decide they are to an extent, but that's within an extent. For example, if you're a major power and you run in a sort of rarefied group of world powers where nuclear weapons are something most of your counterparts have, you probably want them yourself because it's a deterrent ceiling. It's a, you use yours, I'll use mine, we'll both end up in charge of parking lots, let's not do that. It's also, in some ways, a deterrent from conventional conflict with those powers, amongst those powers. Direct conflict. It doesn't always work, and it won't always work, and there have been plenty of times where, despite much obfuscation, nuclear-armed powers have ended up fighting conventional wars. But the thing is, the weapons they have keep both sides, to an extent, honest. They're not going to try for biological weapons or chemical weapons because that's just going to lead to nuclear weapons. And the one thing about humanity is we have a lot of very nasty ways to kill ourselves. A lot of very nasty ways to kill ourselves. And that's another fun thing I run into this channel. The occasional people who believe I glorify this stuff. I don't like those weapons. I never have and never will. They're not nice weapons. There are no nice weapons, really. I have a lot of affection for warships because I see all that goes into them. And I see the history behind them. And I have a lot of respect for the people who fight in those wars and have to do those things because they are put in a situation which is probably the closest to hell humanity can experience this side of an afterlife. And they are asked to make decisions in that scenario and in quite a lot of other scenarios which could condemn themselves to worse or potentially condemn a lot of others to that hell. Making those decisions are not easy. Anyone who pretends they are, I doubt has ever actually been in the role. There is a great line from Wellington. The only thing worse than a battle won is a battle lost. And that's a very true piece of information. And I know someone's going to say, but you can't have very true. It can either be true or not. Well, the thing is, why am I using the phrase very true? Because it's not only true, it needs to be emphasized how true it is. And the other option to phrase to use is emphatically true. And I prefer very true because it rolls off the tongue better, but you can go for emphatically true. You see, the thing about all this, again, once we get sort of the requirements, is working out what you are as a nation and what you need to defend and what you want to do. What are you prepared to do to defend yourself? Below that, you've got a carrier battle group. Are you prepared to use aircraft to strike enemy targets? Are you prepared to hit their bases, to hit their infrastructure? If so, you should probably have those aircraft. If you're not, if you as a country fundamentally cannot see yourself in any scenario ordering a strike on targets no matter what the enemy does, then don't have them. Don't have long-range strike missiles. Don't have any of that stuff, because if you're not going to use it, it's a waste of money. And it's also not going to work as a deterrent factor. Because one of the key things of deterrence is people have to believe you're prepared to use it. They have to believe it. And that's often the biggest problem. Making sure people understand you're prepared to use the stuff you have. And again, when you think about it, if you're going for an expeditionary force, well, what's an expeditionary force which suits one part of the world versus another part of the world? If I'm doing an expeditionary force to Europe, in a European conflict, I'm probably looking at an armoured division. I'm at least looking at a mechanized division of an armoured brigade and a couple of cavalry brigades, i.e. one tank-heavy formation and two tank plus a lot of APCs and fast-moving infantry formation, i.e. armoured personnel carriers and probably other things. Because I'm looking at a maneuver war-capable unit. I'm looking at something which is going to have teeth to punch through what it's probably going to end up fighting. If I'm looking at expeditionary capability, i.e. I'm not a country which is on the European mainland, I am going to be deploying something to them. Because that's something useful. That's something they can plug into things. But guess what? If that's okay on the European continent, but what happens if I'm supporting, let's say, what NATO calls the northern flank? Well, then I'm going to need probably a brigade, an infantry-heavy brigade, with a range of its own vehicles, self-sufficient, because it's going to be fighting in a mountainous Arctic region. It's probably going to need its own, what we'd call, littoral maneuver assets, because it's going to have to maneuver up and down the coast, probably self-sufficiently, and I'm probably going to need to be able to insert it under enemy fire. Again, if I'm expeditionary to Britain, from, let's say, Britain for Europe, I'm putting an armoured division there, I might send it on the train if I can secure the Channel Tunnel. I might not. Depends on what's going on. I might have to send it by ship, but I can hopefully send it far enough behind the fighting lines that I can probably use commercial shipping or roll-on, roll-off ships to move it over there. For America, if I'm the expeditionary from America, well, that's a different scenario, because if I'm deploying the forces, I might well want to have the equipment based in Europe and fly the people out there, because otherwise that's an awful long journey by ship across the Atlantic. And that means I'm going to have to convoy that forces, which is going to tie up escorts. Now, to be honest, since the OHPs went, the Americans are kind of short on escorts. The literal combat ships were going to do that, though, weren't they? Along with about 24 other missions that their light aluminium frames were supposed to do. You see, the reason it's easy for us to point to the problems and the bad examples in American, British, Canadian, French, Italian, Danish procurement is because quite a lot of decision making is done in public. There is usually a lot of public buy-in, even despite the fact that, people say that no one's interested in defense and there's no defense debate. There usually is a regular flow of content and discussion. Even if it's just between the, military Twitter community. Or, would it be now the MilX community? Please say below which it is now. I'm going to go with Mil Twitter, because, that sounds more sensible than MilX. MilX sounds like it should be a movie. And not a low-budget horror one at that. MilX. Anyway. So, you have to work through what are your requirements to do on to deliver on the defense of your first two options. And it's then, once you have to start making your budget match your needs. And that's a tough one. That is a really tough one, because your budget can be full of many interesting things. You could want to spend money on all sorts of different things. You might be a small economy, you might be a large economy. There are many different options here. But either way, you have to make sure it matches your needs. Your choice is either you raise spending or you find a way to reduce costs. That might force you to do things which you don't want to do. If you traditionally like to produce your own equipment, but actually it's going to be a lot cheaper if you buy it from the factory in the other nation. You then have to make a decision of whether the politics of building in your country is more important than the actual number of assets you're going to acquire. Or are you prepared to pay the cost differential? In which case, you're probably going to need to explain that to someone. Because usually, when someone does their initial figures, they use the cost figures provided by companies of, let's say, they already produce it. And they're already producing that equipment in a mature facility that they've built maybe somewhere else, especially if you're buying it off the shelf. Which is the phrase for buying existing equipment. Well, there's a problem there. If you have to build a whole new factory and set up to support your production run, the cost of that factory is now got to be added to the units. The cost of training all those personnel, the cost of moving existing personnel who know what they're doing over to your country to carry out the training, and sending some of the people from your country who are going to be doing the building over to the original factory to do some training, is going to have to be function into the cost. So you have to think through what you're going to be spending your money on. You have to really think it through. And you have other options. You can form up alliances. You can do a joint development project. Recently there was a really interesting example, which was the British and the Dutch signed a joint development program for amphibious vessels. Future amphibious war vessels. And this is a good example. It's broken down already. And there are lots of reasons being given for why it's broken down. Lots of people going, oh, we should be joining up the Dutch again because their equipment looks really good. But one reason it seems to break down is because the British have a fundamentally different view on the Dutch as to the self-defense firepower of the vessels, of what they should have. The British systems seem to be leaning towards an integration of a surface-to-air missile system, a point defense system, probably CAM, the Common Air Modular Missile system. So in naval terms, that's called Sea Scepter. Probably that, and probably some gun armament. Could be Phalanx, could be take its ideas from Type 31 with the Mark 50, with the Mark 110 57mm or the 40mm Bofors. It could do that. It might not. But that seems to be the fundamental breakdown. Also, the fundamental breakdown seems to be that the Dutch are looking for vessels of less than 10,000 tons, and the British are looking for a design which is going to be more than 10,000 tons. And what I found interesting was that no one had had these discussions before they even got into the development program. No one had had that discussion and gone, hang on, what vessel are you looking for? And the reason they got into that program was because it's trying to make their budget match the needs by pooling the costs. But they've actually just wasted money because they hadn't worked out, hang on, is what they're actually want to procure, match what we want to procure? Now, you can say, well, what about those programs which produce a range of vessels, a range of ships built upon a common platform? Kind of like the Volvo car dealers, car manufacturing system, where they basically have a standard form that they adapt to the different roles and shapings of the various programs. You can do that, and that could have been an interesting idea. Develop a common family. The trouble is, at a certain point, the British would be paying for development of one end of that family, and the Dutch the other end of the family. And what's going to be the cost link-up? Command and control systems? Those are mostly available and being bought off the shelf anyway. Weapon systems? They're again going to be off the shelf because these are going to be amphibious warfare ships. They're not cutting-edge air warfare destroyers or anti-submarine warfare frigates. They're going to get off-the-shelf systems which you already support. Landing craft? That's a different procurement. It can sound awfully nice. It can sound awfully good. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good idea. The other end of the spectrum is, of course, people go, well, perhaps we should buy what the Americans are building. Well, the Americans aren't building anything that really matches in that, and the Americans are again another end of the spectrum even beyond us, because their average amphibious ships are 40,000 tons. The LHDs are 40,000 tons plus. They are what I would classify for most nations as a light fleet carrier sized. They are bigger than the standard treaty battleships were, in some regards. They are far too big and far too crew intensive for what the British want. So making your budget match your needs is a constant thing of going, can we afford to pay this? If we can't, what of the would like to haves can we cut? What of the necessaries do we pare down? Or do we raise taxes? Or do we seek an alliance, seek a partner to try and reduce costs? Those are the options. Or you can hollow everything out so that nothing actually can do what it does, but it all looks like you've got that capability. And then when it comes to actually in a situation where you're in trouble, you find out you can't actually do anything. But the important thing is you look like you had that capability. You had that capability on paper. And that's where it matters. On paper. Finally, the biggest problem with procurement, and this is the biggest issue we have today, giving things time to work. The Boxer is probably the best example of this in British procurement, because the British have been in and out of that program more times than a jack-in-a-box. I mean, seriously, we jumped in and out of that program like we were skipping rope on it. In, out, shake it all about. Completely. And part of the reason you have that is because there is an urge for every official, every senior officer, every minister to put their stamp on every program so they can claim its success, and to market their predecessor as a failure. Especially true amongst the ministers, but lots of other options there. That's not good. You see, it used to be a case that a ship could be designed, ordered, laid down, launched, and commissioned in about a 2.5-3 year period. And the average minister's career in post was 3 to 4 years in post. But now, procurement usually could be running for a 20-30 year cycle, and the average minister will be in post for 18 months. I know there are some countries where they're a little bit longer, but really it doesn't help that much. Do you see the problem here? If you have a changeover of leadership every 18 months, and each one wants to stamp on their personal leadership, you have a problem. You can't function that way in such a long procurement cycle. And you can't have a procurement cycle which is a lot more truncated. I know people keep talking about it. Oh, we can buy this and that off the shelf, but ultimately you need to develop what's going to be on the shelf. It doesn't just appear magically on the shelf. It has to be developed by someone, which is a long-term development program. Otherwise, you don't advance. If you want the best example of that, please have a look at the particular made-up universe known as Warhammer 40k, where the Imperium have pretty much for 10,000 years refused to advance because everything they have, technologically wise, was from the Emperor. Or at least that's what they believe it to be. They believe it from the Emperor. And there is a faction within the Imperium called the Mechanicum, who are a very interesting organization. And they venerate technology to the extent that they believe all technology that exists is what can only the technology that already exists and that has existed, especially in certain scenarios, is all that can exist, and therefore innovation is heretical. Yeah, you don't want to be in that scenario when other people are actually developing. But you also can't be in a scenario where people keep changing their minds every 5 minutes. This is one area where I quite like the French, although they don't always manage to get it right because they still have interfering politicians. And everyone else involved as well still tries to interfere. But the French try and legislate these things. They take a decision and they legislate it. So if you want to start chopping around and changing it dramatically, You have to put through new legislation. You have to say what you're going to do. Giving things time to work out matters. We also see this in, how do I put this, a lot of approach to defense journalism today, in that you will often see systems will either be one of two things. They either have a very positive PR, in which case they're glorious and the best thing to ever emerge, the most dangerous thing to ever emerge since the Cretaceous period. They are going to dominate the world. Or they're terrible. They're an actual rust bucket. They're all falling apart. This is pointless systems. And the reality is they're very unlikely to be either of those two extremes. Okay? That's a rather large spectrum between those 2 points. They are unlikely to be at either end. They're likely to be somewhere in between it. And the thing is, if you hear about all the issues in an aircraft as it's teething, as in a ship as it's teething and developing, that's actually a good thing. That's a good thing. Why? Because if they're finding the problems, they can actually have a chance of fixing them. Beware the problems which don't show up till you're actually in a war zone, and then get your people killed. Rigorous testing is going to show problems in new systems. It's designed to. You're testing those things to their limits because you're going to be taking them to a world which is going to be at their limits. So give things time to work. Right, and I always finish videos with a question, and this is not going to be any different. Although I have already asked a question earlier of, put your ideas and things you'd like me to muse about below in comments. And maybe a few other things. Whatever your suggestions are. But today's topic is this. I want you to think back over any programs and procurement programs you've heard about, and I want you to think about the ones which have been run well. And I want you to think about why they've been run well. And please comment below with what programs which you think have been run well and why you think they've been run well. I'll be really interested to see your views. I want this to not be necessarily, I can see it turning into a lot of people going, oh no, that program wasn't run well because of this, this, this. So I'm going to put this now. This channel strives to be a very respectful channel. There are 2 reasons for that. 1, my little cousins watch the videos, and if I teach them new words, the big cousins outnumber me and will hurt me. And secondly, because I fundamentally believe that the best way to have an open debate is to maintain a respectful atmosphere. Because the moment you start doing personal insults, especially intentional ones. Unintentional ones, they happen. This is the trouble with... I do agree with the idea that to have an open discourse, you do need to risk being offensive. But I think there is a difference between risking being unintentionally offensive and being intentionally offensive. Okay, that's where I draw the line. I like it. Respectful discussion, no intentionally offensive intentionally offensive arguments, and hopefully we can have a nice chat below. Anyway, what have we got coming up? Well, this week, we had the conception operation conclusion of the Lexington class. Why is Tracy Carries not aligned? That's weird. And next week we have A45 Squadron. I would also point out in this this week we have, in terms of live, on Thursday, we have what could have been learned if Billy Mitchell had followed the rules in 1921. There are so many options there. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. And as ever, if you like the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want to support the channel and the book addiction which underpins it all, well, please consider membership, consider Patreon, consider Ko-fi. Ko-fi mainly goes on the Iron Brew habit, which is probably quite bad for me, but it keeps me going at this moment. And moving house, as you can tell from the boxes below, the boxes of books behind me, I need all the sugar and caffeine I can get my grubby mitts on. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and have a nice day.